All right, there we go. Well, greeting, folks. Welcome. Thank you for spending your time and energy with us today. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the One Mississippi YouTube channel, and it will send out a link directly to everyone who has registered. The Mississippi River Network is thrilled to host Karen Solas, Stewardship Director at Mississippi Park Connection, and Dr. Marcella Windmueller-Campione, Associate Professor of Silviculture at the University of Minnesota, for this special webinar today. If I'm a little biased, but it's one of the coolest webinar titles that we've had in our online events: Forests in Flux, Stewarding Mississippi River Forests in a Changing Climate. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm glad to be in virtual community with you today. I'm the Director of Outreach and Education for the Mississippi River Network, and I'm joined by the rest of MRN's tiny but mighty staff: Gretchen Hagel, Kelly McGinnis, and Marie Risalvato. Together, the four of us are the staff team behind the Mississippi River Network, which is a coalition of over 70 organizations and businesses working together to protect the people, land, water, and wildlife of our nation's greatest river, the mighty Mississippi. Founded in 2005, the network has grown into a powerful collaboration of people and organizations from the river's headwaters in Minnesota down through the 10 main stem states, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River Network implements the only national public program for the entire river, and that is called One Mississippi, which is designed to educate, engage, and inspire people to take actions for the Mississippi River. Since 2009, One Mississippi has grown a community of over 20,000 river citizens and inspired thousands of actions. A friendly how are ya to our long-standing river citizen community members, and a hearty welcome to all of our new river citizens whose point of entry into the community is this webinar. River citizens are people who want to help protect the Mississippi. From armchairs to wading boots, river citizens protect the river by speaking up on its behalf and caring for it in simple ways that make a big difference. Together, we can protect the river for future generations. Please watch your inbox for our monthly newsletter and other email updates with opportunities, actions, and events like today's special webinar. In Otter news, a few housekeeping items. We are in normal Zoom meeting mode today, so please keep yourself on mute as our speakers are presenting. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box at any time. My colleague Gretchen Hagel will be monitoring the chat box. For any members of the press who are present, if you could please identify yourself and your news outlet when you ask a question, we'd be happy to prioritize some questions from our media colleagues. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly on our One Mississippi YouTube channel. I will also send the recording link directly to everyone who has registered. The webinar will run from the top of the hour. We'll run until the top of the hour, We'll run until the bottom of the hour, and includes question and answer discussion after our presenters. So, how can we best manage and care for our Mississippi River forests in a changing climate? That question is at the heart of a long-term research project in a forest next to the Mississippi River in St. Paul, Minnesota. And today's presenters will share their experiences with the project, including lessons learned and preliminary findings. I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters today. Dr. Marcella Windmueller-Campione is currently an associate professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. She received her BS and MS in forestry from Michigan Technological University and a PhD in ecology from Utah State University. Marcella's overarching research goals are to explore the underlying dynamics of forests, how forests develop or are impacted by current and future disturbances, and to use that basic science to develop management strategies that allow the sustainable management of forest ecosystems in the face of changing conditions. She also teaches a lecture in a field silviculture class at the University of Minnesota and is the co-director for the first module of the National Advanced Silvicultural Program. Karen Solas is the Stewardship Director at Mississippi Park Connection, the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service in the Twin Cities. She works with land managers, natural resources professionals, and community partners to ensure that efforts across the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area are aligned, respectful, and prioritize best practices for climate adaptation. Karen has extensive experience at the nonprofit and government levels in program management, partnership development, and community engagement. She has coordinated many ecological restoration projects, planned educational and interpretive programming, directed a statewide environmentally focused AmeriCorps program, and worked on environmental justice at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It is clear that we are in good hands for the presentation ahead. And Karen, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Solas. I'm the Stewardship Director at Mississippi Park Connection. We are, as Michael said, we are the nonprofit partner and friends group to the National Park Service here in the Twin Cities. We help raise funds for the park, and we also co-manage all of the volunteer programming and a lot of the community programming as well. I think Marcella is in charge of forwarding slides. Is that right? So if you could, yeah, thanks. If you want, I really would love for all of you to go check out our website, which is parkconnection.org, easy to remember, and learn more about us and everything that we do. Okay, next slide. A little bit about our national park, the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. It was established in 1988. It is a 72-mile stretch of the river that travels through the heart of the Twin Cities here, Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's the only national park that is dedicated exclusively to the Mississippi River. It's a little over 54,000 acres, but only a little over 60 of those acres are directly managed by the National Park Service. Next slide. For those of you who are not from this part of the country, we wanted to give you a little bit of orientation. This is the whole length of the river, and you can see we're not quite up at the headwaters. If you can see that the boundary between Minnesota and Wisconsin and where the river crosses into Wisconsin, we are just a little bit west of that, just to give you a little orientation. And then next slide. And this is what our park looks like. We have a little bit of a different kind of a national park than what you normally think of. You normally think of national parks as having a big tract of land owned by the federal government. Our park is actually a partnership park, and as I mentioned, very little of that land is directly owned or managed by the National Park Service. There are a lot of different land managers, which include 25 cities, 5 counties, 2 state agencies, 3 federal agencies. We also have, we're very fortunate to have a lot of wonderful environmental nonprofits and community groups that also play really significant roles in stewarding the land. And I especially want to mention one of those organizations, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit here called Wakantipi Awanyangapi, which just last week entered into an official co-management agreement for one of the parks here in St. Paul. Next slide. The individual park within that national park that we're going to talk about today is Crosby Farm Regional Park, which is the largest natural park within the city of St. Paul. And it receives about 500,000 visitors a year. So a lot of people are using this park for recreation. Though most of the park is floodplain, like what we'll be talking about today, and like that middle of the photo kind of in the middle there with that awesome spider web. The park also has 2 lakes. It's got wetlands. It's got a little bit of prairie, some bluff woodlands with some very cool geologic features. So not only does it provide all these incredible opportunities for recreation, it also provides a lot of really critical habitat to a lot of wildlife, including as part of a major migratory flyway. And then, of course, it has all these really important climate mitigation features like, carbon sequestration, preventing, holding a lot of floodwaters in and water filtration, mitigating the impacts of urban heat island effects, and more. So it is a really, really wonderful, special place for us here in the Twin Cities. Next slide. We are on Dakota homelands here in the Twin Cities, and Crosby Park is also in an area of great cultural significance to Dakota people known as Bedote. Bedote means place where 2 waters meet, or basically confluence. It is the site of creation and a birthplace. It has been a birthing place and a home. And later it was a place where a lot of atrocities were committed against the Dakota people when they were held in a concentration camp in Fort Snelling. as part of the forced exile from Minnesota. So it's important for us to remember all of this, both the sacred and the trauma. And it's part of what inspires us to join in caring for this place so that it can also be a place of healing. Next slide. And that kind of shows you the location of Crosby within this larger context of Bidote. Next slide. About a decade or so ago, all of our land manager partners, we all were kind of having increasing concerns about forest health. There have been all of these kind of compounding factors really affecting our forests. We lost most of our elm trees to Dutch elm disease. Our cottonwood trees, which are really a keystone species in a floodplain forest, are struggling to regenerate. We've got a lot of intense herbivory in our forests. And then, of course, there's so very many impacts of climate change that are really stressing our forests. And then we also knew that emerald ash borer was headed our way. And that is an invasive beetle that we knew was going to be killing off all of our ash trees. Knowing that ash trees make up about a quarter of the trees in our national park, we really started thinking about how can we try to kind of get ahead of this, anticipate the devastation this is going to cause, and do what we can to prevent just having this incredible loss of our forests and having all of these gaps in the canopy. So that caused us or led us to launch a campaign called Plant for the Future, where we planted about 15,000 trees between 2017 and 2021 throughout the river corridor. And we did have climate adaptation in mind for species selection there, what tree species we anticipated would do well with future climate conditions. And that, led us to be having more and more conversations about climate adaptation and motivated us to want to connect managers more with research on climate change in academia, which then led us to the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. So I'll hand it over to Marcella at this point.
Thank you, Karen. And also, thank you all for joining during your lunch hour. It is with humbleness and gratitude to see so many folks across the river and many locations. And I just really want to highlight this is hugely collaborative work and work that requires and brought together so many folks. And so while I get to have the joy of talking about this, I want to make sure and acknowledge the amount and effort and groups that have brought this together and brought this to life. And so this collaborative research, as Karen was saying, brings together the University of Minnesota through multiple networks, as well as being part of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. And I'll go into what that is in just a second. But that network is really based on the idea that climate is changing and that climate change is a global phenomenon, but that is a localized impact that we're seeing. And we're making localized decisions regarding adaptation and management. And that's based both on the ecosystems, but also the location and the people and the history. All those things matter as we think about climate change. And in Minnesota, we're seeing that effect, especially in our temperatures and our winter temperatures, and how that is affecting both our ecosystems, but also us as people as we adapt and as we have these patterns and processes. As well as temperature and the timing of those seasonal changes, we're also seeing really large shifts in precipitations. And while the exact amount may not be changing that much over time, and we are getting wetter, what we're really seeing is like those large, big rainfall events are becoming more frequent. And we're also seeing a lot more periods where we don't have rain as we move into what is now being called our flash drought after a very wet season. And so I just want to highlight how these timings are really amplifying, especially as we think about the river and the communities along the river. We're seeing, and this ends in 2012, which we know past 2020, we've also had major effects in the most recent 5 years. But seeing these large rainfall events is really impacting our communities as well as the river, both near and long term. And so these forests that are a part of the river, our floodplain forests, are critical in so many ways. And just making sure, I saw so many folks who are so familiar with floodplains, but just making sure we're all together. Floodplains are these ecosystems that are seasonally flooded and are next to streams or rivers. They can be both forested and unforested, and we'll mostly be talking about the forested floodplains and kind of the role they have within the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi River, and within St. Paul. And so these are gorgeous locations that are highly diverse. And unlike other parts where elevation is these extreme gradients across many, many feet, we can see these wonderful gradients exist over just a few feet of elevation in our floodplains, going from very, very inundated to these beautiful silver maples to just slightly more into these oak and hardwood masting species. And all of this relates to that river dynamic, that level of inundation, and just the beauty and complexity that make our river our river. And Karen mentioned these change and these disturbance agents, and emerald ash borer is one that is greatly affecting our floodplain ecosystems. And within Crosby Farm, in the area that we're going to be talking about, many of those trees, the vast majority of those trees were ash, mostly green ash. And emerald ash borer shifted that and really killed those trees. And the big part was that we weren't seeing new regeneration coming in. So we were seeing a loss of overstory tree canopy and not seeing those new trees coming in. And with that, really starting to think about how do we steward, how do we develop management, what does that look like? And within forestry and management and this kind of climate adaptive management, we often describe this as our desired future conditions, or what do we envision that forest to look like into the future, and how would we describe it? And do we describe it as staying the same? So we see here a linear path from one to another after disturbance, or is there going to be a shift with that climate trajectory, with change, and how do we help, or how do we steward that change? And so within that is the goal of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. It is a network of experimental sites and locations looking at different methods and treatments, and it's done in a science management partnership. So there's always, in each of these locations, there's always both a science, usually university, and a management partner. And those management partnerships are critical to ensuring that we're thinking about all these pieces and also thinking about the how and the why and the opportunities as well as the limitations as we think about moving this science into practice and operation. And bringing everyone, I mentioned silviculture now a few times. I just want to make sure folks, it's one of those great Scrabble words with the V in there as well as the length, but silviculture is the art and science. And so this is what I do. This is what I am as a professor, as my research area, but it's the art and science of thinking about the establishment, growth, composition, and health of forests, and how we think about that in terms of our value and needs as people on the landscape. And so I like that art is first because each ecosystem is unique. Each ecosystem has a feel, a place, and it also acknowledges there's never any amount of information that will ever capture what the ecosystem is. We can use scientific practices and our understanding to inform our management, but that art always acknowledges that there's a human component and a human piece of being humbled and approaching the ecosystem, knowing we can never capture it. We can only hope to understand and guide and steward. And so with that, let's also define adaptation as that adjustment of systems in response to climate change. So how do we think about ecosystem management, conservation, restoration, and really thinking about that values and also risks? So what are those pieces and how do those overlay in terms of our management? And so briefly, this is a network that stretches across the United States and Canada, across many different ecosystems. And Crosby Farm is uniquely located in an urban floodplain forest, which is so cool to think about how all these sites are using the same system and exploring these topics and bringing that very local information to a very national and international network. And so the Ask network really relies on the spectrum of adaptation action. So resistance, resilience, and transition. And if we look at the bottom, we see kind of our lease, or like the level of risk. So thinking about that gradient of risk and that gradient of change. So resistance, really thinking like trying to push back or try to maintain, where resilience is often, we think of a rubber band, so being able to bounce and like shift and have some of that flexibility. And transition, really acknowledging what we have now is going to look very different, and how do we help or steward or allow transition to maintain important ecosystem functions, maintain values, and what does that look like as we think about now and into the future with climate change. And so we're using this experiment within the Crosby Farm Regional Park, and I'm so glad Karen gave so much context and history, because we cannot do this work without understanding and acknowledging the history and where we are currently within that history as well. And so you'll notice these paths, or these plots, pass a path that, where Karen mentioned, 500,000 visitors walk through. And so the goal is for this experiment to be visible. Folks can see plots from the path. And the goal is for folks to feel comfortable, to know that as a community space, this is not something they're excluded from, but rather is part of the community. And Karen's going to talk about all the ways that volunteers help engage, steward, are indispensable, are so valuable, are just the reason we can do this experiment. And so another visual of this, so we have 24 plots testing resistance, resilience, and transition, as well as a control. So in silviculture, an option is always no management. So what happens if we don't manage, and how does that look? And I'll touch like really briefly on what that means as we move through some of the results. And then we have fence plots where we have 52 individual trees that were planted, that were between 3 and 6 feet tall, on this 10 by 10 foot spacing. And so looking at this, so the big piece and the big management question within our system was, what do we plant? Both from an understanding of like managers being like, we're seeing shifts in forest, we're not seeing regeneration. What do we plant, and what is the risk, and what does survival look like? As well as from a basic science standpoint of, how do trees grow in the forest, a floodplain forest? So understanding all these pieces. And so we use the resistance, resilience, transition framework to look at this. And this is an example of climate change in action. So when we started planning this, we were in plant zone hardiness 4. We are no longer in plant zone hardiness 4 within the cities. We are in plant zone hardiness 5. So from the time that we planned this, thinking about the resistance of how do we maintain and look at species that are currently on the landscape and the seed zone that's currently on the landscape, we have moved into plant zone 5, which is resilience is our current zone. And thinking about, these are species that are on the landscape, but also species that are common along southern Wisconsin, northern Iowa. So broadening the species, thinking about that slightly broader definition of floodplains in the upper Mississippi River. So we'll see some additions from black willow, swamp white oak, American sycamore, and bur oak. And American sycamore is highlighted because while it's not technically in these systems, it is so commonly planted in our urban forests that we felt comfortable including it in the resilience treatment. And then looking forward to that transition, this is where we went even farther south. So thinking those, the northern tip of the southern bottomland, so that Missouri area. So bringing in tulip poplar, pin oak, pecan, sweet gum, in addition to that are all from zone 6, as well as silver maple, river birch, and red maple. So really thinking about community composition, really thinking about testing and seeing different levels of risk and susceptibility in terms of both risk in terms of moving different species, or like a plant hardiness zone 6 compared to what we started at 4, but also risk of not acting. And what does that mean? And so we set up for planting these 1,200 seedlings. Everything was marked. And these were planted with volunteers. And so we planted during a pandemic. And I'm so grateful for the community that came together. This was also happened shortly after the murder of George Floyd in our city. And so working together, listening to our community, this was a space they said they wanted to be at and they needed to be at. And so we worked within the framework that we could, and we planted and we talked and we found space 6 feet apart, putting trees in the ground. And the wonderful thing is, like, those trees survived. And so every year we do annual growth, survival conditions. We're looking at the trees, we're measuring them, and volunteers got trees in 99% of the right spots. The trees they planted survived. When we did have poor survival, it was likely because of stock issues. These trees that were coming from the farthest south came on train during a pandemic at that point. And so they were likely dead before they were planted, and so never leafed out. So the big thing is, like, so much gratitude to the volunteers, and like they did an amazing job planting. So if anyone is on the fence about that, I just have to give it up to the volunteers that did such a great job. And we've been monitoring all kinds of environmental variables, from precipitation, temperature. During higher snowfall years, we've done some snowfall measurements. We've done seasonal measurements with flooding and hydrology. And so just really gathering a lot of information about the space. And we're also lucky to be so close to the airport to have that continuous and long-term record as well. And then weekly phenology measurements that are a combination of folks from the university and volunteers organized through Mississippi Park. And so this is a great opportunity of that partnership of collecting data across many different folks, and that contributing to their scientific understanding of this space. And then getting into some preliminary results, I just want to say a lot of trees lived, and we had close to 87% survival, which is huge. Most floodplain plantings by year 3 are less than like 50%. Some are around 25%. So the survival we had is huge. And so looking across these years from 2020 to 2023, you'll notice pretty high survival, especially in our resistance resilience treatment. This is lumped across all the species. So as well as our transition treatment, seeing a little bit of boost, and that came from some replanting that was done in 2021. And so just really great survival, and really high survival than what other areas and other studies have seen. And when we start looking about this, so if we remember, silver maple zone 4 was planted in all of our treatments, and seeing that we have some differences even within our plots. So that's where we can start to tease out microsite, and also be able to see, like, is this related to community? Is this related to location that they're planted? But we have pretty high survival of silver maple overall. But this is zone 4 that has the resistance and resilience and transition kind of on the left. But we also have zone 5 and zone 6 that have even higher survival. And so being able to see overall silver maple is surviving really well. Is there something more? And we need to do a lot more statistical tests. We need to tease out a lot of things. But we're seeing zone 5 and zone 6, especially zone 6, up to 100% survival. And so does that relate to seed stock? Does that relate to them having more space because there is higher mortality in the transition treatments? And so being able to kind of tease some of this apart. But overall, really great survival. And then looking at these trees across the different treatments and seeing, I know there's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to walk through every species, but the main point that I want to get through is in each of the treatments, resistance, resilience, transition, there is multiple species that over a 3-year period have greater than 80% survival. So there's a lot of options out there in terms of species, in terms of thinking about both level of risk, but also level of options. And how does that relate then within an organization's framework of what works for them? What values are they bringing to the river? What are their logistics? What are their constraints? And how does that fit in? And with that, it's important not only for the survival, but we also want these trees to grow. So many of our trees provide critical habitat when they're in these large overstory features, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a human health standpoint. That buffering of heat and heat island, as well as the flood mitigation. I mean, it's just amazing what those roots can do for soil stabilization. And so we're seeing some of these trees grow more than 5 feet a year. So these trees are quickly moving into the canopy space, maintaining that forest community, and also thinking about that level of risk of species like reed canary grass, buckthorn, and other species that can really shift a floodplain community. And so having this options of not only survival, but river birch growing more than 5 feet a year and becoming really, we're seeing some of our river birch really become river birchy and spready and just beautiful and gorgeous. And so with that, I want to pass it back along to Karen as we move into some of the other parts of our study.
Thanks, Marcella. As she mentioned, this is the only Ask project in an urban forest. And so the intention has always been to try to engage with the community as much as possible around this project. So, and it's been really exciting to see how much interest there has been. We try to say yes to every request that we get for presentations and webinars and tours, and do that. We do that a lot. And so because of that, we've been able to really share the project with a really wide range of audiences. We've had a lot of youth groups out there, a lot of different professional organizations and floodplain restoration specialists. So it's been really great to get to share this project with folks who are coming to us and asking to learn more about it. We also, though, as she mentioned and showed in that map, the project, the main path of Crosby Park goes right through the center of where all the plots are located. So you can see a lot of them right from that main path that those 500,000 visitors are on throughout the year. And so we wanted to have a way for people to, as they're seeing these plots, these fenced-in plots, and wondering what's going on in there, like a way for them to kind of find out what's going on, learn about the project, learn about floodplains, learn about climate adaptation. So we partnered with the organization that I mentioned before, Wakan Tipi Awanyangapi, a local native-led environmental organization. They helped create these wonderful signs that are periodically throughout the research plots that share information about the project, have a QR code where people can go to find out more about what's going on and find out ways to get involved. And they worked with a Dakota artist named Willard Mailbear to design these beautiful illustrations of trees that have significant cultural value to and significance to Dakota and Ojibwe people. They feature the name of the tree in Dakota or Ojibwe and also highlight the trees in different seasons on each one of the four signs that are located throughout the park. Let's see. Next slide. Another major way that folks engage with the Ask plot here, or the Ask project here, is through volunteering. As Marcella mentioned, they were critical to actually establishing the plots, planting them, putting up the fences and the gates. All of that was just a huge lift and really relied heavily on our wonderful volunteers. Next slide. They also help with data collection. She mentioned that some of our volunteers help with that phenology data collection of noticing changes over time and throughout seasons. They also help collect some of the temperature data, and some volunteers are photo monitors. So they take photos periodically from the exact same vantage point to also add to that information of being able to show change over time. Next slide. And then another really important way to be involved with the project is our Crosby Crew, which is a group of volunteers that meet twice a month. We have some volunteers, it's always open to the public. Some volunteers are return volunteers and come every time. We have new folks every time. And mostly these volunteers help maintain the plots. They help with, we do still we have trees, dead trees that fall, or after a storm that might fall and take out some fencing. So repairing fencing or gates, and sometimes vines can be pretty aggressive in floodplains. And so sometimes they start to take down some of the fences or impact some of the trees. So things like that the Crosby crew helps with. Next slide. So we are right now working on a comprehensive report to kind of sum up the first 3 years of this project and take a look at what some of our challenges have been, some of the lessons learned, and what some of the opportunities for the future that we see. But just to highlight a few of those here, wouldn't you know, in a climate adaptation experiment, the biggest challenge has been climate change. And we've just had kind of every imaginable crazy weather thing happen. We've had extreme heat. We've had flooding at a weird time of year, weird unexpected time of year, like extreme heat in very early spring, no snow, heavy snow, drought. We've just kind of had it all. And so it's made it so that we really have to be very nimble, adaptable, and we all have kind of adopted this attitude that we really just have to be ready for anything and not surprised by anything. So that's been a challenge. And then just working in a floodplain is also pretty challenging. We didn't actually have a major flood the first couple of years of the project, but now that we have, that has had a lot of posed a lot of challenges that I'll talk a little bit more about. But even just, we're in Minnesota. Our Minnesota summers, for those of you who are not here, we joke about the mosquito being our state bird. So it's buggy, and a lot of the season you really need a bug net to be out there and to have it be manageable. We've got nettle that grows, 6 feet tall and can get really thick. And so it can make it pretty uncomfortable, and it can just be really hot and humid, and it can be all of those things at once. So it's just a challenging environment to work in. So back to the impacts of flooding, now that we have been through that and experienced it, when Crosby Park floods, especially in a major flood, the entire park is closed to the public. And for us with this research project, that means there's some equipment we have to get out ahead of time to save it from being damaged. It makes data collection really challenging during that flood. And then there are also repairs that have to be made afterwards. Next slide. We want to give you some visuals of what that looks like. This was a day that my coworker and I went in to retrieve some of the equipment. So this was when we were walking in, and it was already, the water was already up to like kind of shin level, just maybe almost to our knees. And then 2 hours later, on our way back, this is almost the same spot, actually even a little higher. And this was only 2 hours later, and it was rising pretty fast. Next slide. And then when we went about trying to collect data during the flood, we have a video that hopefully we can show you that was taken by a volunteer of ours using a drone. He took some drone footage. And this also gives you an idea of what the canopy looks like. Those are our staff, National Park Service and Mississippi Park Connection staff, canoeing in to the research plots to try to collect some phenology data. And this also gives you kind of a good idea of what the forest looks like. You can see a lot of the dead ash trees that are still standing. So it kind of gives you an idea of the impact of emerald ash borer as well. So we had a lot of logistics to figure out and a lot of safety issues to figure out in order to even be able to collect data during this time. And, when these weird weather events happen is often when we really want to see how it's impacting the trees, but it makes it pretty challenging to actually get that data. But we're excited to have this video because this is a floodplain when it's flooded. This is normally a paved path that we would walk down to the plots. And in this state, the Mississippi River actually connects to those inland lakes that I mentioned that are in the park, and it is all just one big flooded area. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we're up against with this project when it's actually flooding. I think we're working on getting back to the slides. Awesome. So moving into some of the lessons learned, I guess the first part of that we're going to talk about in our summary report is just the things that are related to establishing a research project like this. And one of the things we all talk about frequently is just the really big importance of having these strong, trusted partnerships. and particularly partners who are experienced with different aspects of a project like this. Having a partner like Mississippi Park Connection with an established volunteer program and a lot of expertise in community engagement is pretty important to the Ask project. Having a really experienced research partner that has a really strong history of successful collaborations and that is really dependable, that has been obviously really critical. And also the landowner, land manager partner, the city of St. Paul has been like really wonderful, and they've been so collaborative, and they're also open to innovation and willing to work with us in all these weird situations that come up with weather and other things that we things that we couldn't anticipate and have to figure out on the fly. So having that really strong land manager partner is really important. Also, having people with chainsaws is another partner that has been really important for us, especially because these dead ash trees do continue to come down, and they do impact the plots, and they impact safety for folks who are in and near the plots. And so having a partner that can actually just help with some of those kind of tasks and management is really important. Having those roles defined and having regular, clear communication has been really great for us. And a lot of these relationships were already well established for our research project, but if you're establishing new partnerships, you might need to start with that part ahead of time before the project, kind of establishing that trust and figuring out those roles and the communication patterns. Next slide. Oh, this is Marcella. I'll hand this back to you.
Yes. And so some of the biggest things that we're seeing, and please take this within the idea that forests are so long-lived and we are just touching a very short window of time. But we are seeing that planting in the canopy gaps is preventing a lot of the establishments of invasive or displaced individuals and plants. And so we are seeing that maintenance of forest communities and not shifting to open wetland marshes or other ecosystems that are so critical, but maintaining a forest where a forest was to maintain all those parts of it. So we're seeing those trees are doing a really good job of maintaining that site and that space, and also the understory plants that are there. And so in our control treatments, we removed the dead and dying ash to keep it consistent within the experiments, but we didn't plant. And so some of the thought was, if we just put up fences, it's the deer, it's the herbivores that are eating the regeneration. We're not seeing regeneration come in those control plots. So we're seeing some box elder, and we're seeing resprouting of green ash. And it's green ash that's really dominating. But given longevity and research out of Michigan, it sounds like EAB is going to be a part of our system, and those ash trees may not have long-term future. And so there's also seeing that if we don't do something, we see a community shift, and we're seeing it not return to a forest. It's also really important to think about plant size, like the stocks and the species. And so lots of options. And like Karen mentioned, we were seeing that we didn't have flooding, but planting that larger stock size as we moved into a very high flood year really helped those trees stay above water. And so the idea that we didn't get to test early on was, if it's 6 feet, if it's 7 feet, can they stay around? But during an epic flood year, we did see that a species that is 15 feet has enough to stay above water and maintain that photosynthesis longer term. And so that stock size does matter, as well as lots of different options for species. So really thinking about your site, your values, and that level of risk, as well as other management strategies. Protection from herbivory has been really important. So maintaining fencing to reduce deer impact. And then Karen mentioned the nettle. And we do that both from a competition standpoint, giving those trees a little more space, but also the number of people that were in these plots, giving them the space to work in a more comfortable environment. But especially those first few years, that mowing and competition control really gave those seedlings more space, less competition, as well as, like Karen said, removing those vines and fallen trees are all important parts and ones that we could not have done without our volunteer group. And as we move, I think we're actually staying on time mostly. Thank you. Thank you so much. And hopefully lots of opportunities for questions and comments. And I'll stop sharing so we can see each other more visually.
Marcella, could you go to the next slide also, though? I just want to make sure we recognize some of our funders,
Yes.
which I think I might have skipped over, we might have skipped over one slide, which just talked about the importance of funding and having funding that is both long-term for a project like this. If you're thinking about climate adaptation, this is a long haul project. So, we're imagining this as decades long. And so having funders who are interested in helping you get that off the ground, but also see it through. We're really grateful to the Wildlife Conservation Society for being a really significant source of funding for both of those things, getting it off the ground and also kind of taking it to the next steps. And then also, funding that can be flexible. I think when we're thinking about climate change or research projects around climate change, knowing all of these unexpected things that might happen, I think in the future, for funders to consider trying to build in more flexibility so that timelines can be shifted. If you have a great plan, but then you have a major flood when you're expecting to plant trees, it would be in the best interest of the entire project to shift your timeline. But often funding is too restricted on too restricted of a timeline to allow you to make the kind of major shifts that we ideally could make when crazy weather things happen. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that as well as we say thanks to these many funders. And you can go back to the previous one if you want, Marcella.
Super. Well, I told you all at the onset that we were in good hands today with Dr. Marcella Windmueller-Campione and Karen Solas. Thank you both for that very engaging conversation. Let's move right into our Q&A because there were a number of great questions that came into the chat. Gretchen, I'm going to pass it over to you to read off the questions. And please keep in mind, presenters, I know we could talk for like 6 hours on some of these questions, but we have about 5 or 6 already in the hopper in about 10 minutes on our timeline here. So Gretchen, over to you.
Great. First question is from Nikki Henger, and she says, sorry if I missed this. Did you actively water the trees and fence them? I know you talked about the fencing to help with survivability. I'm wondering how the droughts have impacted the trees.
That's a great question, Nikki, and one I did not add, but we did water the trees when they were planted, and so they all received 1 bucket full of water, and then we had guidelines, especially early on when we had those early droughts in 2020 and 2021, where if we didn't receive precipitation for X amount of days, crews of volunteers would all bring out with water trucks and maintain the experiment, all the trees receiving the exact same bucket of water. And so the trees did receive water, especially those first 2 years when we started to move into extreme drought conditions.
But they do not receive water anymore. So in the last, this current period of drought, they're not getting watered now. It was just during the time of helping them get established.
And were all the trees fenced, or was it just specific plots?
Nope, all the trees are fenced, and even our control plot is fenced as well.
Great. The next question is from Mary Ellen Miller, and she asks, how are the American elm thriving? I thought the species was mostly wiped out and planting it was discouraged.
Yes, so we were able to have American elm that is Dutch elm resistant. And so we're seeing really, really great survival of that. And that's something to talk with local nurseries. And there are various different cultivars that have different levels of resistance as well as cold tolerance. That's been the big limitation for much of Minnesota is cold tolerance for the elms that are more resistant to Dutch elm disease. But it's a great species to start putting back on our floodplain forest.
Wonderful. Dale Gentry asks, sorry if I missed it, but can you share what the pre-treatment site conditions were like? Was there reed canary grass or buckthorn? What type of site prep was done before the trees were planted?
Dale, such a good question. And when we had some of our pictures that we had to cut because of time. But the area that we chose to do the study in was areas that had 95% mortality from ash due to EAB. So they were naturally occurring canopy gaps that were not yet infilling with other species like buckthorn or reed canary grass. So mostly nettle, lots of vines. And so the site prep was just removal of all the trees within the 10th acre plot. So those trees were all removed down to the stump. And so we were able to plant safely in there, and then brush sawing prior to planting, and then brush sawing slightly later in the year. And after that, it moved into a once a year brush sawing based on seasonality with flooding and when nettle was starting to move into that 4 to 6 foot tall range.
Thank you. Next question is from Reagan Baker, who asks, did any of the trees that were planted come from the gravel beds around the Science Museum of Minnesota? Or are there plans to grow species this way for future plantings?
So I can take the first one and then I can pass it to Karen on the second part. Reagan, that was the goal. That was the thought when we ordered the seedlings, which happened prior to COVID moving into the United States. So the thought was we were going to order them, and any seedling kind of coming in the spring would be housed in the gravel beds. That did not happen as we moved into lockdown. And so that was the goal, but not what happened with COVID. And so I can pass it to Karen then.
Yeah, for the second part of that, we are still continuing to plant about 1,000 trees a year throughout the river corridor. And we do use our gravel beds heavily. And for anyone not familiar with that, it's basically, it allows us to get bare root trees in the spring, and then you're kind of just sticking them in a pile of gravel that is regularly watered. So maintaining a constant moisture level so those roots don't dry out. And then we keep them there throughout the season and plant them in the fall. And keeping them in those gravel beds throughout that season kind of forces them to put all their energy into developing more roots because they're trying to find nutrients and water. So they develop these really lovely, robust, fine root systems. And then when we plant them in the fall, they tend to have greater survival rates, and they're more adaptable. It's a little less stressful because they're kind of used to being stressed. And then when we plant them, they're better able to establish themselves. So we do use our gravel beds for most of our tree planting, and plan to continue doing that for the foreseeable future. We're finding I think we're starting to get a little bit of information about some species that are a little less happy there, or now that we're also getting bigger stock, if we're planting in areas that we expect to flood, that sometimes impacts things as well, but it still is our main strategy.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Frank Jossi, who I understand is with the media. And the question is, many test plots are near or on hiking trails. Was there any impact from walkers? Did you potentially locate them near traffic areas?
We have not had any impact from walkers, and we are so grateful for. Karen mentioned the value of the work and the network and everything like that. And it truly was something that was part and is part of the community. And it's something I feel greatly privileged to go to scientific meetings and be able to share that we have not had any damage, vandalism, anything on any of these plots with 500,000 people passing through them. And so it is truly a privilege to be able to say that, and to be able to also be in a space where science is not hidden, science is part of our community, and it can be part of the conversation. So.
And Frank, just to add to that, yes, the plots were intentionally placed close to that main paved trail that goes through Crosby, and a lot of the dirt trails that now go around the plots or past the plots are considered more social trails that have developed from people using them. They're not actively maintained by anyone. And some of those trails, those dirt trails, have gotten more use now because of our all of the researchers, all the volunteers and staff who are heading back to those plots. So they have become a little more well-worn, but we're happy when people are checking out what's going on in there.
Great. There are two more questions. Michael, do we have time?
Let's go for it.
Okay. So the first is from Insia Ahmed, and the question is, great to hear about the high survivorship of the trees. What was the follow-up management after planting?
Oh, that's where we are right now in like what our next steps are. And so that's going to be our continued conversation, both internally within our group, but also externally with community of like, what are our next steps? And if we do nothing, that will probably shift as some of our species are starting to compete with each other. And so we might see mortality as some species have more light and some species have less light. We're also talking about next steps as thinning or density reduction. And so do we remove some of them to allow others to have more space to live? And so that's a big question, especially as we think about how many people have spent so long caring for and making sure these survive. But we're moving to a spot where they're starting to be a little too close to each other, and we have some decisions to make. And until we have those conversations, we'll know our next step as we talk through what our options are and what the values of managing or not managing bring to the space and to the experiment.
Great. And thinning is a good lead into this last question from Anne Conway, who asks, what is your understanding of the role of fire in floodplain forest ecology?
So I can start, and then maybe Karen, and this is something where I'm learning so much, and I have the opportunity to work with Prairie Island Indian community and hearing about fire as a component in a floodplain forest. And so fire was a part, and how that shaped these forests and where it was likely based on both human needs and values in terms of reducing mosquitoes and other densely vegetated areas, as well as the timing and seasonality with flood versus drier years and that timing there. But fire is a component of our floodplains. It shapes our floodplains, and humans have been using multiple modes to steward these ecosystems for so many generations. And so, and now thinking about the future, it's one of those pieces that what is that next step, or especially in an urban ecosystem, what is both a risk of including it again, but also excluding it. And so being able to weigh smoke and that impact to sensitive community members, as well as fire on the ground and the influence on the ecosystem.
Yeah, everything Marcella said, I think this has come up, is starting to come up more and more frequently. I think the acceptance and understanding of fire as something that has been used historically forever, and that is such an important part of our different ecosystems, not just prairies and savannas. That is growing, and I hope we can keep having these conversations and possibly explore even testing fire out in the floodplain, even if it's just a pilot in part of this forest. I think that we would have a lot that we could learn from that.
Wonderful. Well, Karen, I so appreciate how you just said, continuing the conversation. Let's do just that, right? This was a 1 hour kind of quick snapshot of this incredible project happening in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, but certainly relevant across the upper Mississippi River, and in fact, across the entire watershed. But we are going to close down our webinar today. Please join me and give me a round of applause for Karen Solas and Dr. Marcella Windmueller-Campione for the incredible presentation today. As mentioned, we will send the recording to all registrants. It will also go up onto One Mississippi's YouTube channel. Be on the lookout for future emails and newsletters of opportunities to make a difference in special events like this. What a turnout we had today. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope everyone has a tremendous rest of your day. Thank you. Take care.